morning. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all. So, as we're talking about emerging technology, there's AI, as we heard in the previous panel, autonomous vehicles, IoT, AR, VR. There's just so many different things going out there. But before we kind of delve into the technology itself, I'm kind of interested to hear from all of your different vantage points, just kind of what you see as emerging technologies, what public policy issues you see them helping to resolve. So, Amna, let's start with you and we'll work our way down.
Well, I work for the Department of Transportation, and it's tremendous when you look at the difference it could make for reducing fatalities through the use of autonomous vehicles. You know, last year in this country was the highest fatality rate for pedestrians in the last 20 years. But there's so much from congestion to even drunk driving. Because why do we take an Uber? We take it to get to the airport, and we take it to go out. And that's what the data shows. And one day when you have true automation, we won't actually have the need to have driver's license. We'll be picked up, we'll know where to go. And so it's so many complex and amazing things that it's going to solve a lot of society's irritations. But at the same time, my job is to look at all of those changes and figure out how to sustain transportation revenues. Because all of the activities, whether it's the shift to electric cars or the movement away from car ownership, that's going to harm the state's revenues. Darshan?
So, on Department of Transportation, we have new kids on the block, the drone technology. And for us, how do we save lives? How do we save time? And money is the main focus. You have heard a lot about drone technology in the last few years, but North Carolina is a leader in unmanned systems, and the focus there comes is that it's our government agencies like the Department of Transportation, State Highway Patrol, you have emergency management. They are the users of this technology, and what our focus has been is to see that as the Department of Transportation's drone program is moving up and we bring in more technology, we want to help other government agencies within the state of North Carolina. So, we have the history of first in flight, and that's in the manned side. We want to continue that history in the unmanned side. And if you have been following the news, you have heard about UPS doing medical drone delivery. That's happening right now as we talk. Flights are taking place at Wakemed Hospital. If you drive by there, you can see these flights taking place. North Carolina is a leader, not just in just in books or in news, but in implementation. So that is where Department of Transportation's drone program is, I can proudly say is the #1 drone program right now in the nation for a government agency because of the different implementations from medical to public safety. Disaster response last year, Hurricane Florence, we were able to use drones. So it's exciting to see this technology being implemented in the government agencies.
Yeah, just to kind of follow on what the previous speakers were talking about, I think that emerging technology is providing insights into our operations that we've never had before. And so they can basically help inform. There are very few policy conversations that can't be informed by all of this rich data and information and data, et cetera. For me, the interesting thing is the flip side of that is how is policy affecting emerging technology and the implementation. So there's some interesting conversations happening in some of the biggest cities around biased algorithms and machine learning and AI. That stuff to me is super fascinating, and that kind of public citizen conversation about what's appropriate, et cetera, is really fascinating, kind of emerging. It's interesting to watch.
I love getting the dreaded last spot. So I think when I think about emerging technology, right, especially from a public sector point of view, we really think about how it impacts our citizens' lives, right? So from the moment they wake up, where they travel through their day, whether it's work, whether it's play, until they come home and go to bed, and everything in between, right? So we've heard transportation, public safety. Jim's got a great point about the data and AI. I have my own opinions on that, because right now the AI is awesome, but it's only as good as the data that you have, so you need to make sure that it's clean, and we don't talk enough about that. So for us, I think it's really thinking about how to tie all these technologies together. So we're looking at it holistically and not just traffic, not just public safety, not just public works. So we really start to think about it at an upper, higher level in terms of how does it all fit together. And then once we do that, we really need to talk about moving outside of thinking about just the city or the town or the county that we live in, and how do we spread that across the state and then eventually, you know, to the nation, because really it's only as good as the bigger that we make it. There are no physical walls around Cary that I'm aware of, so that we need to start thinking about how we work in partnership to make sure that we're thinking about technology all the way across.
There are a lot of great points I want to pick up on from that first round of discussion. And let me start with the point that you just raised, Nicole, about things tying everything together. I think one of the things we see with smart cities is it's one department, one agency, one city. And so how are you all kind of thinking about trying to push past that kind of initial, I guess, launching point and being more interconnected with one another, whether it's city to state or whether it's agency to agency?
So I can talk about Cary specifically, and then I can talk a little bit how we're working as a region. But in Cary, we have a smart city steering committee, so we've got representation from all the departments. Really, the basis of it was actually started out as a data management group, which ultimately is right what it's all about, is the data, and it's grown really into smart cities. And the important thing about that is you really start to look at the interconnections between the groups, right, between the departments, and understand how things work together and where the data flows from beginning to end, and how we can make better decisions on that. To the point about growing beyond, we're working with Raleigh and other communities around stormwater. We know that water flows, doesn't just stay stagnant, and that's an important thing for all communities that are dealing with stormwater. So how do we figure out how to alert others, whether you're upstream, downstream, wherever it may be. We also think about if there was a disaster and, for instance, you know, communication went down in a municipality, whether it's Cary or Raleigh, we would still have data from the other municipalities, so we'd still have some information to go from. So I think it's important to start thinking about these regional approaches as opposed to just thinking about, right? So you're going from the silos inside of your own organization to the silos of cities and counties and states, and start thinking broader.
Others have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, this is hard, right? This
Really
is
hard.
really hard. So Noah, raise your hand. Noah's the City of Raleigh Smart City Coordinator. That's one of his main job, is to try and not break, because it's impossible to break down these silos. It is just trying to create them, make them permeable, right? Just become aware of things that are happening in our city, in other cities around us, with the county, with the state. With, you know, there's just so much going on. So there's this interesting story I have, which is our transportation folks are at a conference right now. We get an email, we're ready to implement this new technology I saw in the demo booth at blah, 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 right? That happens every day in every department across. And so our job is, like, they're trying to solve this particular problem. How do I find out where people are parked? That technology is kind of ubiquitous across the city. We could leverage it everywhere, but, you know, so our job as technology folks and smart city coordinators, et cetera, is to try and corral the cats, you know? And so if you're a vendor, please stop doing this. You know, just kind of coordinate, help us coordinate across all of the departments and just kind of build enterprise kind of solutions.
And from the unmanned side, from the drone side of it, when we, about 2 years back, when we took office at Department of Transportation, we realized that all around the nation, there are these silos created, that Department of Transportation would work only among themselves. The police department will not communicate to the fire department. Then you have your universities that are only interested in research, and they will not collaborate with some of the agencies because they don't see the purpose of implementation. They want research. So there's a lot of these obstacles we found for the success of this technology to move. But in the last 2 years, we were able to do good amount of outreach, bring agencies together. And a great example is, and I mentioned about Hurricane Florence, was the first time public-private sector worked together to respond to a disaster. This was where Department of Transportation led the law enforcement, fire departments, and the private sector companies who have the technology but just don't know where to help. We brought them all together, and we were able to have teams all around the nation, all around the state, and we were able to get the work done faster. This was one of the biggest, change that came in North Carolina, which other states have seen, and they have asked us how this is possible. It's just that technology brings people together, but you have to realize that it needs education. And we want to play that role of educating people that this technology is good. How do we use it? And let's join forces and use it together for a state or for an agency to be successful. There's a lot of information that can be shared.
So on that last part, on the education piece, who were you educating, and what, can you go a little bit deeper on the type of messages that you're trying, because I think this also kind of plays into what you, Jim, had mentioned on the policy side of things and the appropriate use, so I kind of want to move us in that direction.
Sure, education starts from the user level to the management level. A lot of times you have to realize that there are so many great conferences that take place around the nation. A lot of us are fortunate enough to travel and learn about this. But when we learn as management, we are not able to bring it down to the level where the users can benefit from. In the last few years when I've been traveling, we have been seeing this, that everyone at the leadership level, you'll see presidents, you'll see vice presidents, you'll see all these people at these conferences, but a user cannot be there because the cost is too high. So what we realized is that we need to bring this knowledge to our state, to our users, to our people. Now, for a technology to be successful, it's not just the user, but also the people living around it. So if you want to fly a drone for medical package delivery, for an example, the people living in that neighborhood should also be comfortable with it. Public acceptance is a big thing. So education is different, at different levels. So what we try to do is we see the level of the technology that's being used at a specific county or a city, and then see what type of conference or type of workshops we have to integrate. We do free workshops because we realize that, again, if we add cost to it, it's not going to be able to get the attention of everyone. So education for us is very key for any new technology, and we have realized that it works. And this is the model that other states are learning from us when it comes to technology, because public acceptance, public can change and make or break programs, make or break the use of these technologies.
So excellent, great point, jumping off point to talk more about, as you were talking about, Jim, about the policy and the appropriate use. Can you kind of talk about some of the backlash that comes along with this, and how policy is now playing more of a role on the governance of technology, and what struggles you all are kind of facing in this endeavor?
Sure. So I'd love to kind of divide that into two sections.
Sure.
One is on the push side. So, I ordered something on Amazon yesterday, and so the citizens of Raleigh, that's their experience with using technology. And so the consumerization of technology is driving cities to adopt kind of emerging technology, sometimes faster than we're ready for, et cetera. But that is the demand that we're getting from our citizens. They're doing all sorts of AI, ML, right, to tell me which movie I want to watch and which product I want to use. In the public sector, we have a little bit more scrutiny around the appropriate use of that stuff. And so that is the conversation that I hear happening across the city, where the good news is in Raleigh, we're sort of tracking those conversations, where we have some cities that are a little bit ahead of us on those kind of implementation side. And so we're tracking those conversations to see, it's really about comfort, right? What is the citizenry comfortable with? I'm very confident as a technology implementer that we can implement good technology and provide better services to our citizens, but I want to make sure that they're comfortable. And that conversation, I think, is happening in cities all around the country.
Other thoughts?
So, I mean, I completely agree with what Jim's saying. And so, for those of you who don't know, we had a grant a little over a year ago, Bloomberg grant, to test opioid consumptions in our sewer system. And when we moved forward for applying for the grant, there obviously was a lot of dialogue internally around what our citizens would think about that. We clearly can't tell who it is. It's in a basin of 15,000 homes, or so we can't pinpoint who it was, but that was part of the conversation. And I'll say we were very pleasantly surprised, I keep knocking on wood, that we didn't hear the pushback that I thought we would, or perhaps we would. And I think there's two reasons. One, I think, is opioid rate is a huge issue. The overdose is an issue. And so I think there was a lot of educational awareness that we did. Obviously, it was all over the newspapers, all over everywhere, talking about that, and just the education of it's happening everywhere, just not in large cities or wherever it may be. But thinking about the data and what that may mean, right? I think when I think about that as the example, I think people are a little bit more used to having their lives a little bit more open. Obviously, that wasn't the case. Can't tell who it was, but I think it's a little bit more accepting, right? So, but I think that there are areas where it's not. We've seen in Seattle, right, where there's much more scrutiny of some of the work that they're doing out there, where they tried some facial recognition, got a lot of backlash. So I think it's not an even playing field wherever you may be, but I think if you know your community well enough and you're working with them and you're doing education and you're making sure that they understand that we don't have their personal information, I think it's all about what Jim said. It's knowing your community and what you can do and the boundaries there is critically important.
And it's something I want to pick up on real quick that Nicole said that I think is super important for us. Something that we found is we're not doing something to the community, we're doing something with the community, right? So it's just that as we talked about, collaboration's hard, but you need to kind of segment out some time to have some conversations with the community and make sure you're sharing all the information, that you're engaging, accepting ideas, feedback, constructive criticism, etc.
I think another avenue, though, is that from a state government's perspective, government can be a hindrance in terms of regulations to new technologies. And I think one of the things that we struggle with most is what is the role of government in protecting the data that is coming out. And it does seem to be that private citizens are much more comfortable with private companies tracking you. I mean, you think how many apps we have on our phones right now that know we're in this room. But in my job, we're looking at tracking miles, tracking you and taxing you by the mileage, which means we would know if you're leaving state lines so that South Carolina gets that money. And that's one of the most controversial things that we deal with, because they are okay with Google knowing where you are, but not the state.
So on the policy and regulation side, there's two things I would like to point out. One is we represent agencies that have some outdated policies because the technology was not created at that point. So the policy and regulations around those technologies have made it a limiting factor. For organizations, for agencies and government agencies in whole, it's something which policy should be created, which talks about looking at the current trend and of the technology being used and making some changes to it, because as mentioned, government is an hindrance to sometimes to the policies, sometimes to the implementation side. But what is the problem? Like what we realized, one thing is you have for example, the Federal Aviation Administration that's restricting technology like drone use. But when we were in the other side, we were of the same opinion that yes, they are restricting it. The regulations are restricting it. But when we were part of a pilot program where we were able to sit with them on the same table and understand their problem, they said they don't have enough data to change this policy. We talk about new technology, but we know that technology changes. And if we keep changing our policies based on the technology, it's going to be tough. So there has to be data to prove it. So FAA said, you give us data and we will change the policy. Now, where does this data come from? Government agencies don't have this technology to provide the data. And industry are holding this proprietary because they feel that their secret sauce will be leaked out. So as a result, there's a delay in changes, but that is where industry and government agency pilot programs with federal agencies and the regulatory bodies have to start being created. We are moving at a very fast pace, and I keep pointing out drone side because that is aviation is my side. Aviation took over 100 years to be successful, and the drone technology is less than 6 years, and they are saying they want to have people transporting people using drones, goods using drones. Now, it takes time. The 100 years can be broken into 50 years, but this is where you have to work with your regulatory body to start implementing, giving them ideas on changes.
So I want to pick up on the data point because I think this relates to what Nicole was saying at the top of the conversation about data is only as good as you have it. Mm-hmm. So as you guys, and you're all shaking your heads, so how are you dealing with the efficacy of data and trying to get it to be in a place that it's in better shape to help you make the decisions or make the cases that you need to make to your regulatory bodies, your legislatures, et cetera, et cetera? Anyone can go first.
So, this is, I think, emerging technology helps drive this conversation. So we're able to push, in a very nerdy way, push the management of the data closer to where the operational kind of value of the data is being realized. So the mobilization of the workforce, et cetera. You were talking about potentially empowering drivers to track their location, so all of that technology exists, right? It's not Mary in the back office tracking, hey, Joe submitted his log of where he drove this week. It's all just kind of automated. So as much as we can leverage that automation, I think drive some value in, data quality, et cetera.
So I'll talk about Cary. So when we started out, like I said, originally our Smart City Steering Committee was really all around data management, but we really got everybody in a room, and we actually went through every single system that we have, and we documented all of the data that was in there, and we were able to look at where we had duplicate efforts and all sorts of things there, but it's a lot of work, right? To go back, it's easy to start fresh and clean, but that's not the world that we live in, so we have to go back and look at everything we have and make sure that it's as clean as we can get it. And what pieces of data do we actually need, which I think is really key, especially as we start looking at IoT, for example, as we're going to start collecting lots of data, whether it's on the sensors at the edge and how much do we need. So, for example, we were looking at a project where if our traffic signals went into flash and they were malfunctioning, we wanted it to automatically send us a trigger that would open a work order, and then we could resolve it, right? So starting to build in automation. And when we started going through the process, we were collecting all the data from the traffic signals and trying to parse it out. And they were like, all you need is these 3 things, right? And so it really starts you thinking about, you don't need to collect all of the data, right? So when you start thinking about all of the massive amounts of data that you'll be collecting from the sensors that will be everywhere, and I mean they will be everywhere, it's really thinking about what are those pieces of data that you need so that you're able to use that, because otherwise you're just going to end up these huge, massive data lakes of information that you're not going to need.
And I think to what Nicole said, government agencies produce the largest data in the world. So basically, but unfortunately, we have become data hoarders. We just keep saving everything, and we just don't know when to delete it or remove it out. And if you ask users that are actually using this technology, we don't want to delete it, but this has to come at a management level where the policy is created that every year or 2 years something has to be done with this data. When it comes to drone technology, they are improving the quality of images and video, 4K capability, high resolution images, and we are taking images, video, and we are storing it. 2 years later, 3 years later, we don't even know what we did with that. What was that specific mission or what was that data for? But when you ask, is this to be deleted? They're like, no, maybe we can use it in the future. Yeah. So, data is becoming a problem, and our storage capacity is is becoming less. We can't hold this data anymore. So I think data is data management as such, the whole thing is a very big hurdle for technology to progress, because when we want to move to the next technology, our leadership will ask the question like, what do you do with this technology and this data, and can we integrate? So this is where, as technologies are being bought in, we need to see how we can implement them together, how we can use the data, how agencies and can share this data. If we have if we use GIS, I have a GIS background also, so I believe if we bring GIS into this, if we start storing this data in a platform where other agencies can use this, you may not have to duplicate a lot of stuff. But that's a big hurdle. It's as easy as we can say that, okay, we'll create something, but there's policies in that. So there has to be a little bit more strain put in the policy side of data.
And it's so difficult when your government is working with legacy systems that don't communicate with the newer systems, and it's very difficult to pull the data out. It's very difficult to share the data, and it's very difficult to know if that data is correct. We're dealing with an IT staff that doesn't know how to use the systems from 30 years ago, and so you have such select people. But it is the government's role to take the lead in sharing the data. And that is certainly something that we struggle with. But you also see the possibilities. You were talking about the traffic signals. And I was working on a project that was looking at what's called the smart and connected systems, where you're collecting the data, but in the future it's going to be that stoplight is going to change based on the congestion level. It's going to be able to, to change its timing to better, address the proper flow of traffic, or it's going to redirect you through signage if there is a wreck. It really is amazing, and it's how do we use that data, and the other thing is just understanding who the data owner is, and able to connect all of those sources.
So I'm gonna, in a moment, open it up to audience Q&A, but I want to go back to something you said at the top of this conversation, Amna, about, because I think it speaks to government transformation, government redesign as all these new technologies come out. And you were talking about sustaining transportation revenues if people stop buying cars. So can you talk a little bit more about what kind of calculus you're using to think about these are the things that will probably change in the future as we bring things online, and what are the things you're kind of starting to think on to actually replace either lost revenue or other lost expectations?
I think one of the things that is interesting is, are there misconceptions out there that the public has? And I think a lot of this is we have to say we don't know. We know it's coming, but we can't tell you no. We know that the electric vehicle fleet is going to grow, that cars are going to be autonomous. We know that, logically, car ownership doesn't really make sense. When you think, we spend on average $700 a month to maintain and operate, insure your vehicles. But you know what? How often do we use our car? We're looking at my car sitting in a parking lot 96% of the day. And so why are we having this asset that is going to depreciate? And so you look at that and you think, even from a monetary perspective, we're going to change our habits. And then we see people, not wanting to drive more, that they're more interested in taking public transit. And you see, it's kind of shifting how government isn't keeping up with technology, how we're completely caught off guard. Because it used to be, the aviation industry is, you can see it track over 100 years. But, if you work in a large city like Raleigh, you saw how crazy it was with the implementation of scooters everywhere. And governments were caught off guard. Cities were caught off guard. How do we tax them? How do we regulate them? Do we want them at all? Because they didn't ask when they moved in. And so it's so much, and so we do. We look at the motor fuel tax. That's where the majority of taxes come from. And we think, well, that is not going to be sustainable. So we look at taxing those avenues that are creating the instability, like electric cars. And so it is looking at taxing by mile, increasing tolls. And I think one of the big things, the next generation is capturing, monetizing the data that is coming. We talk so much about the need for broadband. The only way to do that, the only way for a connected car to work, there has to be fiber. And that's in right-of-ways. So how do you monetize the data that is necessary? Because I think in the future, that is going to be a large source of revenue for states.
So I'm going to open it up to audience Q&A. If you have a question, just raise your hand. We have a microphone, so I would ask if you would just wait for the mic to come your way.
I'm James Davis from the city of Raleigh. This question is more so for Nicole and Jim. Talking about the duplicate areas of resources and how we're gathering data. What are your stances or vision solutions to combine those collaborative efforts and just make sure everyone's kind of on the same page in the future, how we collect data in the future? As you know, like past tense, it was a log, as you spoke, maybe Excel database, whatever, but we're staying current with, 2030 of how we're going to actually futuristically maintain it.
So in Cary, we've really moved towards a platform approach. So we look at big platforms with a large investment in SaaS and Salesforce, and the Office suite. And so when we think about how to move from all of these siloed applications and the multiple work order systems, that's the way that we're doing it, is to kind of collapse those and build them on one platform. So we'll have one sort of truth of data centralized.
Very similar. So there's two different approaches. One is stop the bleeding, and two is kind
There's that too.
and two is just kind of looking forward. So stop the bleeding. For us, it's an educational thing. Just going out and educating people about all the initiatives that we're aware of, whether they're IT-led or department-led, to show that there is duplication, because oftentimes they're not even aware that they're duplicating data collection. So that's one. Two is there's effort to try and consolidate those two solutions. So we're trying to take a two-prong approach. One is not to stifle innovation, to say, hey, you can't do this, or we instead say, hey, we would like to kind of push you in one direction or another. And then three is kind of the looking forward, is to say, hey, we're aware of all of these video analytic efforts that are happening. Let's kind of, to Darshan's conversation earlier, let's bring everybody together and talk about all of everybody's requirements. Can we all leverage all of the infrastructure that we have, the technology on top of that, and make sure that we're getting the data and information to the people that it makes sense to?
Is there a question in the back before?
Is it working? Yeah, there was a discussion around the data, the different legacy systems, about what percentage of the infrastructure you guys have is spent on just keeping the lights on with the legacy that's actually prohibiting you from moving to a more modernized platform where you can actually monetize the data, leverage the data, put governance around the data, determine who can use it organizationally. Where do you have to basically make it non-specific to a person, but you could actually do trending analysis for your budgets? How much of it is on the old stuff and is stopping you from getting to the new?
So I'll tell you, it's not as bad as you think it might be in Raleigh. From my perspective, we're not in that bad a shape from a legacy system perspective. The challenge that we have now is, I believe, a human resources problem. So the data is there to be analyzed. We actually have some good tools and technology to do that, but everybody is underwater with projects and initiatives where there's so much more opportunities to do really interesting things, but we just don't have the manpower to do it. And the manpower that we do have, they're really talented, they're really smart, they have passion and all of the technical expertise to do these things. Again, I believe you're still gonna find these kind of legacy systems, access databases or whatever, kind of in closets of departments, et cetera. But just in general, many of our enterprise systems are pretty modern technology. You guys
So yeah, and I'll say I don't have a percentage, but what I often like to say is in Cary we kind of live in two different worlds, right? So we still do have an AS400, but then we also have an unbelievable smart cities IoT program, right? And so we have the ability to live in both worlds. And so I think that's an important statement because I think what I've seen in a lot of organizations and not just government, is you get so caught up in having a legacy system that it almost freezes you from moving forward, right? You're like, I gotta get out of this. And you don't seem to focus on the future. And you can absolutely live in two worlds. You just gotta figure out how to do that. Does it take a little bit more effort? Yes, but there are ways to do it. So, when I talk about, keeping the lights on, we do spend a lot of time there, but we're still able to move forward, and definitely in a way that we know how we're going to eliminate, right, as we move forward, how do we eliminate these systems? So we've learned a lot from it, but I think you can definitely live in those two worlds.
And I believe that the life cycle for these things is getting so short. So, so while we don't have legacy systems, we are now, like, the life cycle of applications, et cetera, is now, instead of 20 years or 15 years, is 4 years, right? So we just finished an initiative. Okay, well, we just built something 4 years ago that we pushed into production. Unfortunately, now we need to revisit that technology and modernize that whole kind of stack. And I anticipate that getting really, really, really short. And so there is this, when you say legacy, I think of the AS400 instead of jQuery, JavaScript jQuery, which is not old technology, but it's not new technology either. So, we're gonna, I think governments in general, or just technologists in general, that cycle of just trying to update technology is gonna get shorter and shorter and shorter.
Well, I just want to thank you all for joining me today. Please give them a round of applause.